Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Boss Economics World, where we cut through the jargon, expose the mismanagement, and shine a light on the economic dumpster fires that governments and central banks just can't seem to put out. I'm your host, the one and only voice of reason in a world of economic insanity, and today, we're diving headfirst into the latest clown show from down under. Buckle up, because Australia's Reserve Bank, the RBA, is serving up a masterclass in how to tank an economy while pretending everything's fine. Let's roll. Oh, Australia, what a mess you're in. Just this week, on Tuesday, July 8, 2025, the Reserve Bank of Australia decided to keep interest rates unchanged at a tidy 3.85%. Now, if you're an ordinary Aussie struggling with sky-high mortgage payments, or a small business owner watching your sales evaporate, you might have thought, hey, maybe it's time for a rate cut. Nope. The RBA, in all its infinite wisdom, has decided to sit on its hands, leaving markets, economists, and investors in a state of utter shock. And then, to add insult to injury, Deputy Governor Andrew Hauser steps up to the podium on Wednesday, July 9, 2025, to tell us they're refreshing their research strategy. Oh, fantastic. Because nothing screams decisive action like a good OL research project while the economy burns. Now, let's be real here, this isn't just a one-off misstep. This is a textbook example of how governments and central banks, through sheer incompetence and a refusal to face reality, are driving economies into the ground. And as always, it's the little guy, you, me, and the barista down the street, who's left holding the bag. So, grab your popcorn, folks, because today on Boss Economics World, we're peeling back the layers of this economic onion, from the surface-level blunders to the deep, systemic failures that are setting Australia up for a recession of epic proportions. Let's start with the obvious. The RBA's communication strategy is an absolute train wreck. On Tuesday, Governor Michelle Bullock tried to justify the decision to pause rates by saying it was a matter of timing, not direction. Translation: don't worry, folks, we'll get around to fixing things, eventually. This vague, wishy-washy rhetoric is the kind of thing that sends markets into a tailspin. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. Investors were blindsided, economists were scratching their heads, and the Australian dollar took a nosedive faster than a kangaroo on a trampoline. But here's the kicker, this isn't just about poor communication. This is about a central bank that's lost touch with reality. According to the latest data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, ABS, inflation is still hovering around 4.1% as of June 2025, well above the RBA's target range of 2–3%. Meanwhile, household debt-to-income ratios are at a staggering 185%, one of the highest in the developed world, per the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Aussies are drowning in debt, and the RBA's response is to keep rates steady and refresh their research strategy. Are you kidding me? This is like the captain of the Titanic saying, don't worry, folks, we'll study icebergs more thoroughly next time. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because the RBA's latest blunder is just the tip of the iceberg. Deputy Governor Hauser, in his speech on Wednesday, had the audacity to point out some tectonic shifts in the global economy, as if we haven't been screaming about these issues for years. One of the biggest problems he highlighted: productivity growth, or rather, the lack thereof. And folks, this is where the RBA's mismanagement starts to look less like incompetence and more like criminal negligence. Productivity growth in Australia has been slowing to a crawl, and the numbers are downright depressing. According to the Productivity Commission's latest report, released in May 2025, Australia's labour productivity growth has averaged just 0.9% annually over the past decade, one of the weakest performances among OECD countries. Compare that to the United States, where productivity growth has averaged 1.4% over the same period, or Germany, where it's been closer to 1.6%. Why does this matter? Because productivity is the engine of economic growth. Without it, wages stagnate, living standards decline, and the economy grinds to a halt. So, what's the RBA doing about this? Oh, you'll love this, they're pointing fingers at the public sector. Hauser name-dropped the Productivity Commission, Treasury, and even the government's upcoming Economic Reform Roundtable in August 2025, as if outsourcing the problem is a solution. Meanwhile, the RBA itself is sitting on a $40 billion balance sheet of government bonds, thanks to years of quantitative easing, and doing what, exactly? Here's a crazy idea: how about using some of that monetary firepower to incentivize investment in productivity-enhancing technologies, like automation, AI, or green infrastructure? Nope, too hard. Let's just keep rates steady and hope the problem magically fixes itself. But folks, the RBA isn't the only villain in this story. If you want to understand why Australia is hurtling toward an economic cliff, you've got to look at the government's role in this mess. Let's talk about trade, because Hauser was kind enough to remind us that Australia is a trading economy reliant on world markets. Gee, thanks for the reminder, Andrew. But here's the problem: global trade is in chaos, and the Australian government is doing squat to adapt. Take a look at the latest data from the World Trade Organization, WTO, released in June 2025. Global trade volumes are projected to grow by just 2.7% in 2025, the weakest performance since the post-COVID recovery. Why? Because free trade is under attack. The United States is slapping tariffs on everything from Chinese tech to European cars, while geopolitical tensions in the Indo-Pacific are disrupting supply chains. Australia, a country that relies on exports for over 20% of its GDP, is getting hammered. Iron ore prices, one of Australia's biggest export earners, have plummeted 15% in the past 6 months, according to Bloomberg Commodity Index data, thanks to a slowdown in Chinese construction activity. And what's the government's response? Crickets. Here's where the satire kicks in, folks. Imagine if the Australian government treated its trade policy with the same urgency it applies to handing out tax cuts to mining companies. Oh, wait, they already do. According to the Australia Institute, fossil fuel subsidies cost taxpayers $11.6 billion in 2024 alone, while investment in renewable energy, an industry that could actually boost productivity and create jobs, was a measly $3.2 billion. This is economic malpractice on a grand scale, and the RBA is complicit by refusing to call it out. And speaking of renewables, let's talk about climate change, another tectonic shift Hauser mentioned but conveniently glossed over. Australia is one of the world's most climate-vulnerable economies, with extreme weather events costing the economy an estimated $24 billion annually, according to the Climate Council's 2025 report. Droughts, bushfires, and floods are wreaking havoc on agriculture, which accounts for 12% of Australia's exports. Yet, the government continues to double down on coal and gas, while the RBA sits idly by, pretending monetary policy has nothing to do with climate risk. Here's a fun fact: the European Central Bank, ECB, has already started incorporating climate risk into its monetary policy framework, tilting its asset purchases toward greener investments. Meanwhile, the RBA is still living in the 20th century, treating climate change as a side issue rather than an existential threat to the economy. Wake up, folks. The world is moving on, and Australia is being left behind. So, where does all this lead? Straight into the jaws of a recession, that's where. Let's connect the dots: sky-high household debt, stagnant productivity, a crumbling trade environment, and a government too busy pandering to fossil fuel tycoons to address climate change. Add in the RBA's refusal to cut rates, and you've got a perfect storm. The IMF's latest World Economic Outlook, published in April 2025, already downgraded Australia's GDP growth forecast to 1.2% for 2026, one of the weakest in the developed world. And that's assuming no major shocks. If China's economy continues to slow, or if global trade tensions escalate, we could be looking at negative growth by mid-2026. And who's going to suffer the most? Not the RBA governors sipping champagne at their next research strategy meeting. Not the politicians handing out tax breaks to their corporate cronies. It's going to be you, the hard-working Aussie trying to pay your mortgage, keep your business afloat, or just put food on the table. This is the real cost of economic mismanagement, folks, and it's time we called it what it is: a betrayal of the public trust. Now, before we wrap up, let's talk solutions, because unlike the RBA, Boss Economics World isn't here to just complain, we're here to fix things. First, the RBA needs to stop dithering and cut rates. Inflation is stubborn, sure, but the risk of a debt-driven recession far outweighs the risk of a few extra percentage points on the CPI. Second, the government needs to get serious about productivity, starting with a massive investment in green infrastructure. The International Energy Agency, IEA, estimates that every dollar invested in clean energy generates $3 in economic output. Why aren't we doing this already? Third, it's time to rethink trade policy. Australia needs to diversify its export markets, fast, before China's slowdown drags us into the abyss. Look at Canada, which has aggressively pursued trade deals with the EU and Southeast Asia to offset its reliance on the US. And finally, the RBA needs to follow the ECB's lead and integrate climate risk into its monetary policy. Stop buying coal bonds, start buying green bonds. It's not rocket science. Folks, the RBA's latest stunt is just the latest chapter in a long, sad saga of economic mismanagement. From productivity stagnation to trade turmoil to climate inaction, Australia is a textbook case of how to turn a resource-rich, prosperous nation into an economic basket case. And the worst part? The people in charge, the RBA, the government, the so-called experts, don't seem to care. They'll keep refreshing their strategies, holding their roundtables, and patting themselves on the back, while the rest of us are left to clean up the mess. But here's the good news: we don't have to take it lying down. Share this video, spread the word, and demand better from the people in charge. Because if we don't, the only thing steady about Australia's economy will be its steady decline into oblivion. This has been Boss Economics World, where we tell it like it is, no matter who's listening. Until next time, stay smart, stay angry, and stay boss.